Welcome to Standard Costing. We have some introductory material to share with you about the background, the purposes of standard costing, and how it was developed. Because standard costing is a really important and complex tool that has been a core part of the development of our industrial economy since, actually since the 1800s, actually since before 1800s, even the 1700s. Because it was developed in the late 1700s by someone we'll talk about a little bit later in this lecture, Josiah Wedgwood. So it is an extremely important technique. It is extremely sophisticated and complex, and it's very helpful. We are going to learn about a little bit of the history so you can position it and know why we use it in a certain way, why we don't, when you want to think about it. And we'll also look then in the following lectures at the technique itself. So today's lecture is the setup for understanding why it's considered so important and the effect it's had on our life. It's had an effect on all of our lives. Our life would not be the way it exists now without standard costing. We wouldn't have the same products, we wouldn't have as many things, they wouldn't be as cheap. Basically, the industrial economy would not work without standard costing. Now, it's not the sole reason, obviously. And it's one of the small but essential pieces of that system. And there are many pieces and many people that contributed to it, but without this contribution, the system would not work as well as it did. Now, we are also at an inflection point. So the world-class or lean manufacturing actually keeps a couple of pieces of standard costing, but a lot of what you're learning in Chapter 3 is actually a move to a different level of organization that functions in a different way. So we will see some elements of standard costing even in lean environments, but because a lot of organizations don't change extremely fast, what we will see also is a large parts of lean will continue to, or large parts of standard costing will continue throughout all of our careers. So one of the first things we want to look at is the list of what standard cost does for us. And 4 things. So standard cost does 4 things possibly. You don't have to do all 4 of them. When I say all 4 of them, by having the standard cost technique working, you can get these advantages. So you just choose whether you want to use this advantage or not. So the original one is to control human labor, to control the worker. This is why standard costing was developed in the late 1700s. And it is it has continued to be one of the main controls of work in all industrial organizations, because the workers know how many things they are supposed to produce in a certain period and what the quality is. So it is what gives a focus to human work to make it disciplined and controllable. That is negative and positive, okay? If management is unwise or a little bit tough or just nasty, it can be a really bad tool. It can really be an oppressive tool. And so part of our history is this has not been used as a creative tool for most of the history. So since it was developed until now, it's been one of the main tools, and one of the main reasons is to control the worker. Second is pricing and budgeting. If you want to do anything about the future, such as pricing, when I say pricing, if the salesperson goes out into the field and they get an offer, I keep using these, I need to get something else. Okay. Let's say you're making power tools, and your salesperson is going around the country, this is going around the country, and trying to sell power tools to the different stores. And one of the stores says, I'll buy a bunch of these, but only if you'll sell them to me at this price. Well, that salesperson has to know, is that price so low we're not going to be profitable? You don't want to base your price on cost. That's a bad idea. Cost-based pricing is bad. However, when you do your pricing, you really do need to know your cost to know if you're accepting a deal where you're losing money. Sometimes that's okay. There are times when you accept a deal knowing you'll lose money because the deal has a future or a relationship. So that's still a totally reasonable thing to do. You just need to be aware of it when you're doing it. So pricing means being able to negotiate a price with somebody and know that that future deal, the one you haven't done yet, is actually going to be profitable. Notice if it's a future deal, there's no accounting records for it yet. So you can't really use the accounting system. It has to be some planning system. The other part is budgeting. Doing your budgeting in advance with standard costing saves you 80-90% of the work and time, and also the reliability. Instead of having to regenerate all those forecasts all the time, you actually maintain them continuously. So this is a very valuable function of standard costing. It's all used. The other one is preparing financial statements. This is brilliant. If you use standard costing to prepare your financial statements, once again, it cuts the time of statement preparation by, more than 90%. Okay, it really lowers the cost and difficulty of preparing financial statements. Certainly for your interim statements, where you're not really audited, is definitely perfect. Even for your audited financial statements, it'll allow you to prepare the statement faster. Then, when either you or the audit find a place where your estimate is wrong, you can just post an adjustment. But the statement itself can be prepared quite easily with standard costing. So this is a really important advantage. The other thing is cost control or cost reduction. That idea is you go through the standard cost card, which we haven't really seen yet, although I've talked about it. And that would be in the next lecture. We'll put one up on the board. You go line by line at all your costs, and you just say, can I reduce this one? Can I reduce this one? How can I do this? What can I do? Using that standard cost as the vehicle to have those discussions is the fourth tool. All four of these tools were used by most every major corporation from, say, 1925 or so, 1930, until today, as long as they were run as traditional companies, meaning that thing I say all the time, top manager-led, top-down, hierarchical, social class structured companies all used this, and it worked pretty well. It got us to where we are. Okay, so it created the wealth that we have in Canada through that system. Now, what we found and what you're learning about is there is a system beyond that a lot of people are migrating to, and that would be the world-class or lean system. The lean system does not use all four of these. It uses usually only two of them, and that would be these two in the middle. For pricing and budgeting, okay, right, it's still good when you're out negotiating a price or a deal with somebody to know when you're getting close to the profitability point, and standard costing will help you know that. And preparation of financial statements, sure, that doesn't change at all. Lean, not lean, world-class, traditional. If it's easier to make financial statements, it's easier to make financial statements. What's missing, though, not missing, what we walk away from and stop doing is we don't control workers with this system anymore. Another way to think about world-class manufacturing and the lean ideas we're talking to you about is that basically the workers control themselves, and the management steps away and stops using tricks or manipulations to control the workers. The system evolves in a different way, and the managers, it's not that the managers give up control. They don't give up anything. What happens is they realize, if I want improvements, I have to behave in a certain way. And so because I like the improvements and I'm making more and more money, I'm now in the box of not being able to tell people what to do, because as soon as I tell them no or try and boss them around, they're going to stop doing the improvements. So the system itself has evolved and changed. This is absolutely not empowerment. Empowerment is a word from the old system. Empowerment is a word from top-down manager-led companies. Because if empowerment means I give you power. If I give you power, guess what? I can take it away. So when people are given power in that way, they know it. They never make a full commitment because they know the next manager, next week, next pressure, next target that's missed, whoosh, it's going to get pulled back, right? So empowerment is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the organization evolves to a different set of relationships, which means no more explicit control of workers through an accounting control type of system. The other thing that falls off of the same way is this. One thing you realize in lean or world class is you really can't save money by studying money. The only way to save money is to study people and objects and places and interrelationships. You cannot reliably save money by looking at costs or looking at financial statements. You have to go to the field, you have to go to the factory, you have to go to the store, and you have to say, how can we make this easier? How can we make this smoother? Okay, because making things easier and smoother and taking out errors, that's how we save money, really. This was okay, but now we are moving to a level beyond it. So we have standard costing, a very sophisticated, very powerful tool that in some places has done all four of these. And for most of, like your parents and my parents' lives, we're in organizations where it did all four effectively, brought us along, but we can now see that there's another future where we go to a different way of thinking, and we then abandon these more old-fashioned top-down ways of controlling the people. But these two stay. So standard costing is still good, and we're still going to be using it. If you, in your experience, get out there, there is a movement in some people called lean accounting, and what they say is you should get rid of standard costing completely and do something else that's, it's okay-ish, but, it's not bad. But they say abandon standard costing. I believe they're incorrect, because what they're not thinking of is that these benefits remain, and they don't affect the people inside the company. What they should be saying is get rid of all the parts of standard costing that impact the workers negatively and the company negatively, but keep the parts that actually allow you to save money in your financial statements. They're just like a bunch of religious fanatics, and they just say throw out standard costing, get rid of it, and and they've come up with something else, except that the thing they've come up with doesn't have standards. So the thing they've come up with is actually not bad, but it's closer to an actual cost system, and that means it's not too good at doing either of these two things. So, maybe it's a little bit of a miscue. As they made the change, and it was an American Western European move called lean accounting, I think they moved a little bit too fast. They should have slowed down a little bit and said, okay, no, let's keep it a little bit. So here we have them, the purposes. The next part of this lecture that I'm going to talk about is actually about this aspect. Why controlling workers is thought to be so important. How do we start doing it? And how are we still doing it? So, history time. We're going to be talking about a really famous business genius for a bit. And when I say really famous, he is really famous across 250 years. Okay? So he invented standard costing like 250 years ago. He's still known for that. And that's the least of what he did. So of all his many accomplishments, standard costing, which is vital to our culture and our business society, is actually one of his less known and least important accomplishments. This guy made accomplishments and contributions across like every possible dimension. He was a scientist. If you are a potter, if you've taken like a pottery class in school where you threw a pot, okay, I was going to say put it in a kiln, but I tried to say throw it in a kiln. Don't throw it in a kiln. Put it gently into the kiln so that you fire that pot. He actually invented the main method that was used to calibrate the heat of kilns that's still used even today in small craft kilns. Now, industrial kilns and some of the more expensive like school kilns have electric temperature gauges. However, I still remember being in high school, and in a ceramics class I took, we were firing stuff, and they had little cones, and each cone would melt at a different temperature, and you would put them in, and you would fire up the kiln, and then you would watch through this little tiny hole, and when you saw each one slumped in order, when a certain one slumped, you know it had reached the temperature that you needed for that glaze or for that firing. Well, he invented that, and it's still used even today. The list of things he invented just goes on and on and on. He also was, a lot of people think of sort of as the person that invented marketing. And I don't mean advertising, I mean marketing in the sense of a deep understanding and relation with your customers. Things that he invented, we're still doing. I think you've heard of buy one, get one free. You've heard of catalogs of pictures. You've heard of celebrity endorsements. Though those 3 and another 10 were originated by Josiah Wedgwood in England in about the 1760s or 1770s. So the guy's really a genius. This is him. His picture's been up there for a few minutes. You can see by the hairstyle, this is a long time ago. This was, like 1760, 1770, 1780. He became famous for his art and his craft because of the Portland vase. This is a piece of art called the Portland vase. It's in the British Museum. It is actually glass. If you get to visit the museum, you can see it. It's on display. It's about 2,000 years old. This was made in Rome somewhere, I think, like plus or minus 50 years, plus or minus 50 years around Christ's birth. Okay, so somewhere right around that. But it's glass. And they still don't know exactly how it was made. If you look at it, even in this photograph, you can see that it's a dark glass, really well formed, but it has white appliques on the top. But these appliques are quite detailed. They weren't hot molten glass that was just sort of blown on there. Somehow these were crafted at a high level of detail. That's really, even till today, never been duplicated. Now, what happened in the 1760s is someone put out a prize, and they suggested to Josiah Wedgwood, he said, boy, see if you can duplicate this. There was actually a prize. It was like, you won 1,000 pounds or something. A rich person put up like a prize for someone that could duplicate the Portland vase. So Wedgwood took this on, and this is what he came up with. So this is his copy, of the Portland vase. Now, he didn't actually copy it because he did his in stoneware. It's not glass. But if you look at it, he hit a peak of beauty and technical proficiency in stoneware that has never been exceeded, really. We do the same quality work he did, but he actually hit the quality right then, and he hit the imagery. If you compare those, the Portland vase and his jasperware, he called it, vase, you'll see that he actually has, in a sense, he's duplicated the artistry of the Portland vase, but in stoneware. And he became completely famous for this as an artist. But what he needs to be known to us as is he is actually the person that made this cheap enough to sell. This, even though the first one was, of course, done as one piece, he actually created the first factory to make stoneware. And they made this type of thing. You notice he also made it in green. So this is another one. He made it in black also. It's called basaltware. And he started selling it. He would make them in advance and put them in his store in London. Another innovation, having a display store where all his goods were displayed. That was another Wedgwood innovation. But after he did that, he figured out how to make these things. And the beauty is astonishing. Oh, one other thing is they still make them. The Wedgwood pot bank, they call it pottery, is still owned by the family. And they still make some of these designs. So there are Wedgwood designs that are still being made today that are 250 years old. And one of the reasons we like some of these images, because it's in our culture. Our culture has in it an appreciation for this type of image. We understand it. Even if you wouldn't want it in your house, you still understand it as being an important piece of craftsmanship, and you understand the artistry of it. And that's that like white on the dark, the matte color. It's not a shiny ceramic. But also those images, those Greek and Roman images, we see those all over our culture. And one of the reasons was Josiah Wedgwood, because he's the person that figured out how to do it cheaply enough that he could sell thousands of these things. So they became distributed everywhere, and then everyone copied him. So he is also at least partially responsible for the fact that we use so many Greek and Roman images throughout all of our culture for all purposes, and in all parts of, clothing, food, except wherever, It doesn't shock us to see some of these images. Well, he was the first one to mass produce them in a tangible way. But a problem that he had was, how the heck can he make these things cheap? Okay, so that's actually one of the ways he innovated. In addition to the whole list I told you and the whole other list that I haven't even mentioned, he started breaking down the jobs to where there were smaller pieces. So he created the concept of a factory where one person does one part of it and masters it and then passes it over to the next person that does the next part, the next person that does the next part. So he is the one that, using those techniques and developing standard costing to put a quality and time standard on it, he's the one that got the cost cheap enough that he could sell it to even upper middle class people. Before Wedgwood, that type of pottery that we saw was only owned by the absolutely most wealthy people, and it was all handmade one at a time for that king, earl, duke, whatever. So we're talking about the top 0.25% of the population. After Wedgwood, it was now cheap enough that the next couple of layers down could actually own this stuff in their house, could actually have an item of beauty like this that they could own. Now, it was still the middle class, of which there were not many people, but this was a gigantic change over a fairly short period of time. The way he did it was to control the labor. He came up with the idea of a standard. Okay, if my potters are turning, if you've taken a class or seen it, you have some clay, it's on a disc, the disc spins, and you use your hands to shape the clay. He came up with the idea that, for this kind of shape, a potter should be able to do 5 of these in 1 hour. And he tested it out with different talented potters. And he said, okay, yeah, that's it, 5 an hour, bang. Doesn't seem like a lot to us. That was magical. Because he also had another problem to solve at the same time, which is, how do I start this? Basically, drunkenness was pervasive. The amount of alcohol that people consumed at that period of time was 3 to 4 times larger than what we consume. And in fact, that was the measured quantity. In fact, it was even larger than that, because when they do the statistics on alcohol consumption, they talk about per capita, over all members of the population. But actually, little kids don't drink a lot of alcohol. So if you sort of say, now at that time they did drink beer. So beer was one of the only things that people could drink. Water was unsafe. So it would typically be beer and wine in England at that time. Kids didn't drink a lot. So if the average was actually at that point in time, like 1600s, a little bit over 100 gallons of beer per person per year. But that included little people that weren't drinking a lot. And there are always some people that didn't drink any beer at all. So probably adult male workers were probably in the range of more than a gallon of beer a day for their entire life. And that means you can't have industrial production, right? Think of that. If you have 2 liters of beer for breakfast and 2 liters of beer for lunch, can you do precise work? Even think of your work now. If you had 2 liters of beer for breakfast, which would have been the norm in England at that time, how well could you type with 2 liters of beer? How well could you sit at a potting wheel? So this was a gigantic, gigantic problem. And it had to be solved at a big scale before this could be done. So actually, standard costs has as one of its purposes is to, when we say discipline the workers, is to actually somehow stop the flow of alcohol into the factory. And they couldn't do it in the obvious way of just saying no alcohol, because there were really no obvious substitutes. You couldn't, milk, pasteurization had not been invented at that time. So milk was really dangerous. Nobody would ever drink milk. The only milk you'd ever have in your life was from your mother, and only suckling from her breast. You would never, no person would ever consume milk in any other way. Well, maybe not ever, but, I'd say most people never would ever. There might be at the odd time a few people might. But you would never do it because it would be regarded as dangerous because you have no way to preserve it. Same thing with water. In England, there was a strong bias against water because it's just flippin' dangerous. So the only things that were safe to drink were basically wine, beer, and, later whiskey. And then whiskey got to be whiskey. It's basically alcohol or gin. One of the examples is here. This is, if you study art in your life, you will see this is a famous woodblock print by Hogarth. It's famous for a couple of reasons. One, it's a great print, but also, notice it's called Gin Alley, and it's showing a street where everyone is drunk, including the little babies, because gin was the cheapest thing that was safe to drink. And alcohol's cheap. I mean, you might think of it's expensive. Some of it might be expensive at stores, Mainly that's taxes, which are pretty high, on all alcohol products, and marketing, because alcohol is absolutely one of the cheapest liquids to make that is safe for us to drink. And so what happened is, in England and in Canada, the technology to distill spirits hit sort of perfection in around late 1600s and became really widely distributed in the 1700s. And that was associated with another problem, which is we couldn't store food. Even today in Canada, probably 30 to 40% of the food that we grow rots and is thrown away because even our distribution system, we can't make that big lot size. Okay, I notice I'm pulling in the word lot size. If you have a field of wheat, you have to harvest the whole wheel. That's wheat, the whole field. That's a lot, right? And you can only do that once, and in some southern areas you might get 2 crops a year, but in most of Canada you can only get 1 crop a year. And somehow we have to use that every day of the year. So that's a lot size kind of problem. Well, even in Canada today, 30 to 40% of all the food that we grew of all types rots. Back in those days, it was well over 50%. But guess what? Almost anything that you can grow can be turned into alcohol and distilled. And if you distill it, you can save it forever, right? Vodka, which is, it all is vodka. They called it the gin craze. Gin is just vodka with some flavorings in it, just like whiskey. It all starts the same. All the flavors that you might know of whiskey, brandy, whatever, blah, 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 is it flavorings that are added later from the original sources. So, that's the cheapest stuff that there is. And anything that you can grow that you can't eat, you can make into alcohol. So we were floating on an ocean of alcohol throughout all of the Western countries. Here in Canada, the exact same thing happened. Titanic volumes. Actually, almost, practically, I don't know, every farmer had a still. Probably a quarter of the farmers in Ontario had stills that they had in their backyard. And apples were primarily made into alcoholic cider. Something like 80% of all apples harvested in the New World in the 1700s were planted and harvested specifically to make apple cider, hard cider, because you could store it. The other cider you couldn't store. If you had sweet cider, non-alcoholic, it could go bad really quickly. But if you could get some alcohol, get it up to the point where it was like, 7, 8, 9% alcohol, that had a shelf life. Because we didn't have plastic, we didn't have refrigeration. So the technology meant that the only real thing we could do to a lot of stuff that made sense was convert it to alcohol. And then we had this ocean of alcohol hanging around. We didn't have good health warnings, not a lot of advice, had a huge alcohol consumption. And that created the temperance movement too. So Christians were typically loved alcohol and were in favor of it until about this period of time when the social destruction got to be so awful that's when certain Christian groups started becoming anti-alcohol. It was right around the early 1700s, mid-1700s, because, I've read stories about York. Now, our city, Toronto, used to be called York, or the piece, York is one of the components now. And if you were to be in York in, say, 1750s, 1780s, evidently, if you were to walk through the street, you would find somebody passed out, completely drunk, on every street corner as you walked. Okay, so that's the level of what we saw. So the social destruction is terrible, and also the ability to make a product is zero. How can, people that are like that can't make things. They can make 1 or 2, but even half of what they make is going to be defective. So the other problem, the other half of this, one, standard costing basically said either make it right, you make 5 of these an hour or we don't pay you. All of a sudden it's starting to put some economics behind this need to be sober. But the other thing they did is they brought in religion. So this is a time when a number of Christian sects in England started to become anti-alcohol. And what the manufacturers would do in the Midlands, this is the center part of England, it's the manufacturing core of England, including Wedgwood. They would go to London, hire a preacher from an anti-alcohol group of, Protestant dissidents, and they would bring him back and say, come and be be the preacher in my town. I will build you a church and I'll pay your salary. And the preacher would come, and then they would say to their workers, I'd like you to work in my factory, but you have to go to this church. And in that church, they were anti-alcohol, blah, blah, all the church stuff. Well, it sort of worked, and one reason is that church stuff is pretty good. I mean, just forgetting for a minute the whole God part of it and the religion part of it, if you just think about what preachers and rabbis and imams, and priests tell people to do, it's pretty much all good, right? Because they're all saying, act respectfully, don't hurt people, So whether you believe in the religious, spiritual aspect or not, basically we had a group of people that in order to work and get money in this factory, they had to go to this church and listen to someone telling them how to behave. So the circle started off slowly because people are out of control. We can't control people. We know that. They just legalized marijuana. Why? Because all the laws trying to control that just didn't work. Because guess what? You can't control people. You can't really stop people from doing stuff. And finally, we gave up. They had the sense to go, well, whoops, that was a 50-year-long stupid mistake. So now marijuana is legal. Well, at that time, we were doing the same thing, but we have some things that people were willing to give up. Okay, so those people, you might think they were just drinking and being stupid, but actually they were more free as people than we are. We're a bunch of sheep. Those people, one of the problems is, come to work at 8 o'clock, and they would say, why would I want to do that? I'll come to work when I want to come to work. And you say, well, no, but I need the factory to start at 8. And they go, well, that's nice. I understand that you might have that desire, but, I'm a free person, and I'll come to work when I want to come to work. And lots of other stuff. So those people were a much more free and open people than we have any idea of. We're the most sheep-like of all humans that have ever been created, because you and I, we are a gigantic bunch of rule followers. We do stuff like we stay in our lanes on the highway. We signal when we turn. We stop at red lights. We follow most of the rules. We come to work at a certain time when the boss says. We come to class at the scheduled time. Think of the maze of rules you follow. Well, that is a huge, huge achievement of our society. Well, actually, maybe it's not an achievement. If you like buying stuff like this, if you like living a life where you're buying, products and objects that are high quality and cheap enough that regular guys like you and I can own them, then you might think it's a trade-off. But part of this little lecture segment is to stress to you that it's a trade-off. As humans, we gave up a huge amount of our individuality and our freedom for the right to have calculators, for the right to have cars, for the right to have safe food. Okay? So some things like the safe food idea is a little bit easier to accept. For some people, the idea of, I'm giving up all of my discretion because, I want to own calculators or objects, that's a little bit harder for people to accept. But we've done it. And you and I, we are the biggest sheep in the history of planet Earth. There's no one, there are a lot of us, right, in a lot of countries that are like this, but we are the biggest rule followers ever. Those guys weren't. So the effort of, when I had this up here, this was crucial. To us, it might seem like a little silly, like, it helps you manage things a little bit better. But it was a different time, and people were out of control. And so this part, controlling humans, was gigantic. And the fact that it was successful was gigantic. It actually allowed the Industrial Revolution to happen. Without the Industrial Revolution, you and I would not be here. We wouldn't have any of the stuff we have. Now, you can argue about some of the stuff we have is sort of stupid. But, large-scale life at the level of health that's possible to some of us today would not be possible without this. And without this, I mean control of workers, control of people. Now, we have reached a point where we're going past that. And that is in the companies that have successfully moved to lean, what they've done is the workers control themselves. That the benefits and the rewards and risks are more evenly distributed, so the workers bear more risk, and they also get more of the reward, so they don't need to be externally controlled. So we are still in a high control environment. In fact, the lean environment is higher control than the standard costing environment, but the control is primarily internal set of controls, not a top-down set of controls. So there we go. That's a little bit of a short history, partially how we're here. You're going to get another one of these when we talk about activity-based costing, something that moves us a little bit more into the current time. But don't forget, you think you're a normal human being. You're actually a tame. You've been domesticated and tamed in order to do what you're doing. And sometime in your life, you may go to a third world country, or you'll read about a country like Haiti, which is total chaos. Or Costa Rica is actually not chaos. But El Salvador, Guatemala, countries in Africa, and you'll say, like, why can't they get their act together? And from our point of view, they can't. They can't, they don't have any, they can't make stuff down there, really. Why? Because they can't follow rules. But you know what? If they were to look at us, they would think we were crazy. They'd say, why are you doing what those people tell you to do? Why do you think you have to walk in those lines, drive in those lines, follow those rules, do what other people say? Right? So to them, if you're down there and you're working with them, it's really easy for people like us to disrespect them and say, come on guys, get your act together. They are living an alternate reality. And if you're down there, if you're working with them and you're trying to get them to, learn how to do it our way, you're actually trying to get them to give up a lot of their humanity in order to get some toys, the toys that we happen to like and maybe we value. But, it's important when you work with them to respect how they are and what they're doing, because it is actually sensible. It's only not sensible if you want to, if you want to be able to buy cheap calculators, then what they're doing makes no sense at all. But you know what? If that's not your goal in life, we shouldn't be criticizing that other way of working. It is good to recognize, though, how we work, how we got here, and the sacrifices that we've given of our own individuality to get here. And also, I'll say this again, I said it a minute ago, in many ways, that's the biggest change between the traditional manager-led top-down system and the lean or world-class system, is that the control has now become more diffused and it's passing. And so most of the control is hard to spot, but it's people controlling themselves and their colleagues more than just a manager looking down, watching people and telling them what to do. And it's affected everything. So that is a little bit of a cultural background information, introduction to standard costing and its purposes. And in the next lecture, we'll look at some of the techniques and start to build up the computational complexity. Bye-bye.